You ever stop and think about how an idea, a story, a message, how it survives over hundreds or even thousands of years? I mean, it's kind of like a huge centuries-long game of telephone. The original meaning can get twisted or faded or just completely transformed. Well, today, we're going to dive into the art of untangling those messages.
And this, right here, is the central question, isn't it? Seriously, think about it. The language has changed, the culture is completely different. I mean, the entire worldview of the person who wrote it is basically alien to us. So how do we bridge that massive gap? How do we listen to the past without just hearing an echo of our own voices? It's a huge challenge, and today we're going to explore the tools we have for exactly that.
All right, so let's start at the beginning. In this first part, we're going to look at that core challenge, this idea of imperfect transmission, and we're going to introduce the formal name for the art of untangling meaning.
It turns out there's a whole field dedicated to this problem. It's called hermeneutics, and it's basically the art and science of understanding. It gives us the tools to interpret, well, everything. From ancient scriptures and philosophical texts to legal documents and even social events. You can think of it as the how-to guide for making sense of meaning itself.
You know, the name itself tells you a lot. Hermeneutics comes from Hermes, the messenger of the Greek gods. But here's the thing, he wasn't just some divine delivery guy. His job was to translate and interpret the messages of the gods for us mortals. He had to bridge the gap between two completely different worlds. So, hermeneutics isn't just about reading words on a page. It's about mediating, translating, and making meaning clear across a huge divide.
Okay, so to really get a handle on this, we're going to do something that might seem a little strange. We're going to take a leap from ancient philosophy into a totally different field, biology. Stick with me here, I promise this is all going to connect in a really cool way.
Here's the big idea. This problem of information changing as it gets passed down, it's not just a human language thing. It's a universal principle. The transmission of information is never perfect. And that's true whether that information is a story being told around a campfire or a genetic code being copied for the next generation. And this is a perfect way to picture it. Just look at the polar bear and the camel. They both come from a distant mammalian ancestor, right? So they share a kind of original genetic text. But over millions of years, that DNA has been interpreted in radically different ways to fit their environments. Thick fur and small ears, that's a successful interpretation for the Arctic. A hump that stores fat and wide feet for the sand, that's a successful interpretation for the desert.
So let's break this down using our new vocabulary. The DNA, that's the original text. A genetic mutation, well, we tend to think of it as an error, but it's really just a random change in that text. It's an imperfect copy. And this process, this imperfect transmission, is what creates new versions, or alleles, which are basically like new potential meanings for the organism.
So which of these new meanings gets to stick around? Simple, the ones that work. An adaptive feature is just an interpretation of the genetic text that the environment, the context, has selected as being successful. The environment is what determines which meaning is the right one.
Okay, so now that we have this powerful analogy from biology, let's bring it all back to the human world. Let's explore the art of interpretation itself and see how our own understanding of, well, understanding has evolved.
And that is the core connection. See, when we reinterpret a classic story for a modern audience, or when the meaning of a word shifts over centuries, it's not necessarily a mistake or a corruption. It's an evolution of that idea. It's a brand new interpretation, adapting to a new environment.
The field of hermeneutics itself has evolved too. It started with thinkers like Schleiermacher, who thought the whole goal was to get back to the author's original, exact intent. Then Dilthey came along and said, whoa, wait a minute, we also have to understand the author's entire historical world. But then came Hans Georg Gadamer, who argued something truly revolutionary, that our own perspective isn't a bug, it's actually a feature of understanding.
For Schleiermacher, the goal was pure reconstruction. He saw any misunderstanding as the enemy, something you had to avoid at all costs by carefully analyzing grammar and trying to get completely inside the author's head. His mission was to close that gap between then and now, completely.
But Gadamer just flips this whole idea on its head. What he's saying here is that the distance in time between us and the text, it isn't a problem we need to solve. It's the very thing that makes new understanding possible. Our modern perspective, what he called our prejudices, which really means our prejudgments, not negative biases, allows us to ask new questions and see things that people at the time just couldn't. We can't step outside of our own skin, and that's not a failure. It's a fundamental part of interpretation.
So if we can never be purely objective, then how does understanding actually happen? Well, this brings us to the engine room of hermeneutics, a concept that explains the whole process, the hermeneutic circle.
Now, I know it sounds a little like a paradox, but it's actually something we do all the time. Think about it. You understand a sentence by its words, but you only understand what the words mean based on the context of the whole sentence. It's the same with a book. You get the story from its chapters, but as your understanding of the whole story grows, it changes how you see each individual chapter. It's this constant back and forth cycle.
And that's the crucial point. Reading isn't passive. You're not just downloading information. It's a dynamic dialogue, a conversation. You bring your questions to the text gives you answers, and those answers lead you to new, better questions. Meaning is actually created right there, in that back and forth.
We've covered some pretty deep theory, but let's make this super concrete. In this last section, we're going to see why, in the world of interpretation, context is absolutely king.
Take a look at this. Seems simple, right? It's just a hand gesture. But what does it actually mean? Well, that depends entirely on where and when you are.
Here in the US, a thumbs up means great job or all good. But in other parts of the world, that exact same gesture can be a deeply offensive insult. The text, the gesture itself, is identical, but the meaning is completely transformed by its cultural context. This is hermeneutics in the real world, every single day. And this principle is absolutely everywhere. When a judge has to interpret a law that was written 200 years ago, that's hermeneutics. When a theologian studies ancient scripture, that's hermeneutics. But it's also a doctor trying to understand a patient's symptoms, a sociologist analyzing a social movement, or even a safety expert figuring out the human factors behind an accident. It's a fundamental part of how we make sense of the world.
And that really brings us to the big takeaway. Meaning isn't some static thing that lives inside a text, just waiting for us to find it. It's a living, breathing thing that is co-created in the moment of interpretation, born from that interaction between the text, the reader, and their unique worlds.
So, I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. If every time we engage with a text from the past, we bring our own context and create a whole new layer of meaning, what does that say about our relationship with history? Are we just passive observers reading what was, or are we actually active participants in that great big game of telephone, constantly reshaping and rewriting the past in our own image? It's a pretty deep question. Thanks for joining us.